hello everybody. It's great to be here. It's always a highlight on the conference calendar for us. I'm Kate Jones, Head of Learning and Professional Development at Vitae, and joining me today is my colleague Dr. Katie Wheat, Head of Engagement and Policy. So this morning we're going to share some thoughts about the broadening role of researcher development in shaping the research culture and environment. So the argument that we'll be making is that the landscape of researcher development has changed over the past 10 to 15 years, and there's been what we're calling a cultural turn, by which we mean a move from focusing on the development of individuals primarily to a much broader focus on research culture. And this has been accompanied by a change in the role of researcher developers, so a broadening of their role and their remit. And we're seeing that increasingly researcher developers are acting as the bridge between individuals and policy. And of course, changes in researcher development respond to and influence changes to the higher education landscape and the landscape more widely. And these are shifted in ways I'll discuss later. So our starting point was to compare and contrast the aspirations and aims of researcher development in the early 2000s with the current researcher development landscape. And we asked what's changed. So this is probably a familiar story for many of you, but I'll tell it anyway. In the early 2000s, there's a growing requirement to establish the career of researcher as a valued profession, evidenced, for example, by the Roberts Review and the European Charter and Code. I should say, by the way, I know my references are very tiny. There is a full set of references on the slides. I just didn't want to make the text the slides too crowded. So what we see in the Roberts Review, the European Charter and Code, are that the key challenges were a lack of clarity about what constitutes a research job or career and about the defining characteristics of the researcher, and also a sense that researchers weren't recognised and perhaps didn't recognise themselves as professionals. So there's this focus on establishing clarity about the professional role of researchers, and this is primarily, although not entirely, focused on the development of individuals. And there's an important point here as well, which is that although the word competencies is used a lot, and as we know, this term encompasses the skills, the knowledge, the behaviours and attributes of researchers. Actually, what we see is that the focus was more on skills than behaviours. So today, although of course developing the knowledge and skills of researchers remains important, there's more of a widespread recognition of the importance of behaviour change and a sense that collective rather than individual behaviour change will influence improvements to research culture. And alongside this, there's been a change of attitude with regards to terms such as resilience, for example. So previously, the language that's used at policy and practice levels tends to suggest that it's up to the individual to navigate and overcome some of the challenges of the research environment. And increasingly, what we've seen is a recognition of the systemic and structural natures of many of these challenges to do with research culture, and much more interest and willingness to work collectively to tackle these challenges. And I think there's also more understanding and recognition of the key roles that researcher developers have to play in understanding, articulating and developing research culture. And this shift is perhaps linked to a changing understanding of the factors that contribute to the development of research culture. So more kind of sense of the importance of initiatives and activities on the ground that kind of bottom up alongside the top down change. So our research questions, which we're definitely still in the process of answering, are: what role do those working in the professional development of researchers play in cultural change? And also, how does research development impact on change in research culture? Now, we do have some evidence which suggests that knowledge and understanding of and responsibility for research, culture and environment is increasingly becoming a core element of the remit of researcher development and researcher developers. So, for example, a recent survey of researcher developers, heads of research development and doctoral school directors, among other roles, revealed that their institutional priorities in researcher development for the 21 to 22 academic year were equality, diversity and inclusion, that's 88% of respondents, wellbeing and mental health, again 88%, and research culture. And this emphasis from respondents on the importance of creating a healthy and inclusive research culture and environment was reflected in the language of their job titles. So these are including terms such as culture and environment that we haven't seen in an earlier study of researcher development roles and careers. In addition, data gathered from a workshop recently at Vitae Connections Week last month on the impact of researcher development. It was led by Heather Mackenzie and colleagues at the universities of Southampton, Ulster and Strathclyde, and many thanks to them for allowing us to present this data, shows that researcher developers are playing a number of important roles in relation to culture change. So that includes influencing strategy, sectoral awareness, governance, policy and strategy development and implementation, advocacy, so ensuring researchers' voices are heard, building connections and community building, and also contributing to research activity. So what we're seeing then is kind of a broadening of what's included under the umbrella of researcher development and within the roles of researcher developers. And importantly, the participants in that session reported that this set of activities is below the waterline, so that the metaphor that was used in that session was that of an iceberg and what's visible and what's hidden. And these activities were below the waterline, so they're not necessarily visible to those outside of the researcher developer role. Now, and this is the historian in me kind of coming out, it's really tempting to try and identify the factors behind these shifts, but I think what we can see is that it's really difficult to pinpoint kind of what's the cause and effect, because now that things are changing direction becomes self-reinforcing. But we do have some suggestions, and these are only suggestions. One being that the shift to research culture may have been catalysed by the new emphasis on research culture and the creation of a healthy environment within the 2019 Research Development Concordat. We've also seen, a really increased focus on wellbeing and mental health that seemed to really intensify from around 2016, 2017. There's a growing emphasis on equality, diversity and inclusion in higher education, and that's linked to developments, as we know in wider society. You've got Black Lives Matter, that hashtag first being used in 2015, and then more particularly to higher education, in the 2013 Cape Town and Oxford Roads Must Fall campaigns, particularly around kind of decolonisation of the curriculum, and more people of colour attending university than ever before. And we've also, very recently with the pandemic, seen these intensified challenges, which obviously do include wellbeing, mental health and ED&I, resulting from the pandemic and associated impacts on research and ways of working. And this is another potentially important factor. And obviously also the recognition of the ways in which the pandemic has increased inequalities for underrepresented groups. So sorry for the whistle stop tour here. I'm trying to get through to make sure I'm not impeding time for questions. So we haven't got any hard and fast conclusions, but what we do have are some questions, and it'd be really interesting to hear your views. So thinking about the first questions about what are the implications of this cultural turn for researcher development and researcher developers. This question made me think of that famous Spider-Man quotation, with great power comes great responsibility. So, it's great that researcher developers are getting this influence, but what are the implications of this? it's a responsibility to listen and to think, do the things we're trying to achieve benefit all researchers? Change on behalf of others needs to be approached carefully. With reference to the second question, that concern about are researcher developers confident they're ever able to meet these responsibilities? I think that we need to kind of think a little bit about the work-life balance and well-being of researcher developers themselves. We know that they already have this split attention, between individuals' professional development and institutional work around research culture. So we're going to be focusing at Vitae on this point with reference to the Vitae career framework for researcher developers. And then finally, we've just reached a really important milestone of the RDF refresh project that I think colleagues have heard about. And this has followed an internally focused research project and some community consultancy sessions. And so we're currently focusing on how can the RDF fully represent the behaviours and attributes that researchers need to develop individually and collectively in order to make a valuable contribution to changing research culture. And an important point is that, of course, research culture isn't monolithic. It's local in researchers' teams and groups and departments and institutions, as well as on a national level. So it's trying to take account of the local within a framework that is necessarily universal. Thank you.